is Lisa Heywood, and I'd like to welcome you to Callers Chat, an online space that I've created for callers to come together and chat about all things calling. This month, I'm delighted to welcome Bob Morgan to our stage. Now, Bob is a self-confessed nerdy science teacher, and by night, he's a nerdy dance caller. He's got over 15 years of experience, and he's really interested in how cognitive science can make us better callers. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Bob.
So yes, as Lisa said, I started calling in 2006. Publicly calling in 2006, about 3 months after Kaylee Sock went, "You look like someone who'd like to do Kaylee calling," which was about 6 weeks after I'd started Kaylee dancing, because Kaylee societies work that quick. So yes, very quickly I was suspiciously calling for John Brown's double booked event, which was awful. I can go into that later if you like, but that's the worst gig I've ever done. It's all been up from there, which is quite pleasant. And then yes, I did my degree at Sheffield. I did an chemistry degree at Sheffield. I did another chemistry master's at Warwick. I started doing a PhD at Warwick. After 1 year, I went, "I hate this. This is not for me," and I escaped. At that point, I reevaluated what I was doing with my life and went, "You know that calling thing I've been doing? I quite like that. Maybe I could do a job that does that as well." And a year later, I went into a teaching PGCE. So yeah, the calling led to me teaching rather than teaching leading to me calling. After a few years in teaching, I got to a point where I was going, I really need to work out what I actually want to do with teaching, because I'm not sure what's going on here. I don't know enough, and my PGCE and the CPD I've been doing hasn't helped. That's the point at which I turned to Twitter, which wasn't quite so on fire then as it is now. And there is a fantastic community on Twitter of research literate educators. And I found a bunch of books, and I started reading things and going, oh, there's like science here and things to think about and really interesting things. And that's how I ended up at this point going, now I've done this through my teaching and I'm thinking about it through teaching. Maybe I can feed it back into my calling. So yeah, I have some slides. Let's see if I can persuade them to do what we were doing earlier. Magic. Okay. We actually had that. Lovely. So, cognitive load theory and folk dance teaching. I've specifically said teaching because I think some of this is probably relevant, but not necessarily as useful in the context of an evening Kaylee, because an evening Kaylee or even a PTA function or whatever, we're doing short-term teaching. We're not necessarily doing long-term teaching, and this is somewhat more focused on long-term teaching. At a workshop or something like that, where you want people to take away stuff and remember it properly. But there is stuff for evening gigs and daytime gigs or whatever, one-off parties, that sort of thing here as well. And so I came across this stuff called cognitive load theory, and I thought it was really interesting. And it builds from a number of different models, but this is my favorite. This is from a researcher called Daniel Willingham, who's written a bunch of books and done some really good research and all sorts of things. And it's a model of memory, because his view is learning is a change in your long-term memory. If you've not changed your long-term memory, have you really learnt it, or is it just sort of gone in and gone out again? Because we forget over time. I can talk for a long time about forgetting and remembering, but that's a separate thing. What we have here is our environment, everything around us. we select from that stuff we pay attention to. There's stuff we're ignoring all the time. Really love flabbergasting my students by saying, look over to the left, now look to the right, now left, back to the left, back to the right. Did you see the blur in the middle? No, your brain edits out the blur. Otherwise, we probably suffer from motion sickness. It's very difficult to see the blur when you move your focus, but it's there. All of us have a blind spot in our eyes because there's the bit where our optic nerve connects in the back of our eye. There's a bit of your vision you can't see, and your brain just paints over it. We ignore all sorts of things. And that's just sort of fundamental biology ignoring. Think about, especially for those of us who are able to focus in a crowded room, it's very difficult, but you can, and you can ignore things. But then someone calls your name, that tweaks your attention. So there's all sorts of things going on there, but we focus on stuff. A lot of a teacher's job is directing that attention so your students focus on what you need them to focus on. That goes into your working memory. Your working memory, also known as your short-term memory, is a bit of a problem because it's a bottleneck. You can remember, well, different studies, different numbers, 3 plus or minus 2, 4 or 5 plus or minus 2, depending on the study, discrete bits of information. That's why it's so difficult to remember a phone number that you're trying to remember as you walk into another room. Not that many of us do that anymore. You just tap it out on your phone that you're carrying in your hand. But that's why your working memory is a problem, because it is limited. If you can put that up into your long-term memory functionally infinite as far as we can tell. There's not an obvious limit to it. Sherlock Holmes, when he said, I don't learn new things because it pushes out old things, was not learning things thoroughly enough if he was having that problem. Which with Sherlock Holmes, I imagine, was actually the case. He was just studying lots and lots and lots and not returning to stuff. Part of that is that remembering cycle back into the working memory, back into learning. You've got to keep doing that over and over again. If anyone wants to know about that, you need to look up Ebbinghaus. And if we don't, we forget it. It's gone. You can learn it again or pay attention to it and put it in your working memory again, but you haven't really remembered it. So the problem is dancers or new callers or musicians or callers in new situations. Expertise doesn't transfer well, actually. So whenever we're put into a new situation, calling a new style of dancing, if it's sufficiently different to what we usually call, we're back to square one in many ways. We're bombarded with new information all the time. A beginner dancer walking into a ceilidh, into a workshop, doesn't even know what they need to pay attention to, let alone all the things they could be ignoring. So they've got a huge challenge ahead of them to work out what's going on. The new information, the new combinations of that information and stuff we haven't chunked and automated, come to that, overwhelm our working memory and we lose stuff all the time. And we've all seen this if we've called weddings. You do a dance, you think, oh, that's great. They've got the hang of counting to 8 and doing a do-si-do. You do the next dance, it's mostly the same people. They can't do either of those things anymore. Maybe just because they've gone and had a conversation with someone and they've caught up with someone and now they've forgotten what you meant. It just goes. So we have to be careful. There is a concept of load, which is quite useful for thinking about what you're doing. You've got your intrinsic load, which is your task. And this is maybe more manageable in a workshop or a lesson than at a wedding, because your extrinsic load is everything else. Can be the manner and structure of your instruction, but can just be the fact that the DJ is trying to set up, or the best man has started a fight with the maid of honor, or whatever. You've got lots of distractors. Could be the buffet is setting up and they've got distracted by the fact there's now food. So some of that we can manage, and this is always an interesting problem. We want to maximize our intrinsic load to help people learn if we're doing teaching, and minimize the extraneous load. In the context of a wedding, party, whatever, you want to reduce the extraneous load, and you probably are not trying to maximize the intrinsic load. You're just trying to make it as easy as possible. But that still is useful to think about. Is there anything I can reduce here? So the first really hard thing to do in terms of reducing the extrinsic load is cutting stuff. It's the hardest thing to do, I think. The big one in many ways is, does the audience need the background of the dance? And these are all not absolutes. This is not me saying they don't. This is me saying think about it, because you've got to if you want it to work. At a wedding, nah, they don't care that much. They want to get on and dance. In a workshop where you're talking about the history of the dance, it might be the most important bit of information you're giving. So you've got to think, what's important here? Is this dance with a Schihalian reel going to happen? I really need to change that sentence on that slide. Do you really need to fit one last new dance into your workshop? That is from a caller who will remain nameless, who I saw this try and do this. And they tried to fit one dance extra in the workshop and it fell apart. Everyone's brain was overloaded by the rest of the workshop. They couldn't really take it on. Got to think about it, cut it, do another dance that you have already done in the workshop, perhaps. Do they need to do the steps to do the figure? Do they need to do the figure and to do the steps? More of a maybe sort of couple dance, or even a Morris question. We'll come to sequencing in a bit, but you might want to think about that. Is it necessary? And it might be. You might be going, actually, no. I mean, if I'm teaching a hornpipe dance, even in a wedding, I'm going to teach a step hop because the dance doesn't work otherwise. Am I going to try and teach a wedding crowd to do a skip change? Probably not, unless they're quite good. These are things you can play with to manage the load. One thing you need to do, if you're teaching a workshop especially, is think about your steps. How do you get from one place to another? I don't mean walking steps or anything like that. I mean, how do you get from walking in time to the music to weaving along a line alternating shoulders to completing a hey for 6, arriving on time and passing by the correct shoulders at each end? If you are wanting to teach that, those 3 steps have to happen, I reckon. How you get there is not necessarily set in stone, but you should think about that sequence and how you're going to get there, because that really helps you with cutting out the extraneous stuff. Think about where you're starting, where you're finishing, and be clear. A lot of this is going to be basically be clear about what you're doing. If you're in a workshop context, you can pre-teach. You can say, we're going to do these things. We're going to learn these separately. This is something I do a lot in beginners workshops now, is my beginners workshops tend to actually be out of context of any specific dance. Here are a sequence of figures. And I've deliberately done that so they chunk the individual figures rather than putting them in the dance. So when I send them off to other, and this is particularly something like a contra workshop, if I'm doing the beginners contra workshop, I'm sending them off to other callers. What I want them to know is not I've learned these dances, but I've learned these figures and I can stick them together. So I'm doing the pre-teaching for other people there, and I'm teaching the figures and the vocabulary so that they've got the chunks later. Because one thing we can do with the stuff we have as experts is we chunk information. It's a really fascinating thing going from novice knowledge to expert knowledge. If I said to you, do a hey for 6, you can do that. That's a chunk of information. You know how to do that. Chain across, do-si-do. These all seem like now relatively simple figures, I imagine. But they're not. They've got huge numbers of moving parts in them. Even a do-si-do, you've got to deal with another person moving for a start. That's chunked to automaticity for us. Once you've got that for a dancer, you can put things together. So that's a really helpful thing. Break things down, and then you can build them up. And again, that comes with a sequencing. And I've seen both of these work really well. You can go from part to a whole, and you can go in either direction. You can go from whole to part. So you could go from individual figures up to dances. You could go from one figure to two figures to three figures to four figures, building it up as you go along. And you might go from the end of the dance to the beginning, or the beginning of the dance to the end. So the example I have in my head is if you're doing a rapper workshop, you might actually want to start with the last figure in a dance, so that no matter where you get to in the workshop, your workshop can produce a dance that finishes. Or you might want to start at the beginning so that it makes sense sequentially because you're doing a dance that needs build up. Other things you can do are simplify the conditions. So start with just the figures, add the stepping later. Just the stepping, add the figures later, depending on what you are wanting to focus on. How you choose to do that changes what your learners are going to come away with having focused on. So you need to think about what they're going to learn. So I want to talk about, and actually this slide is slit. So one thing is to remember that there's this really annoying problem called expertise reversal. Things that work with beginners don't work for experts and vice versa. And it's something people tend to forget if they're not thinking about it. I've had a lot of people tell me, oh, that won't work for beginners because it doesn't work for me. That's not necessarily true. Things that work for beginners will work for beginners, and things that work for experts will work for experts, but not necessarily vice versa. Demos and things like that can work really well for beginners, but annoy and frustrate experts, depending on context. You might be better off, you might engage experts better by getting them to problem solve. You wouldn't want to throw a set of beginners at a here's the notation, work out the Playford dance workshop. But a group of experts are going to love that. They get to problem solve. They know all the knowledge they need there. This is one of the reasons why labeling workshops better at festivals is a really good idea, because there really are different ways that different people at different stages of learning are going to take it better, and it would be helpful if people knew better what they were going to do. So you got your experts, add variations, contrasts, different rhythms, all those sorts of things. But you've got to be careful, because even an expert can be overloaded. So you've got to be careful. And actually, in my experience, an expert getting overloaded is going to react sometimes worse when they come a cropper. So you've got to be careful. Redundancy occurs when you have the same information presented at the same time in two ways at the same time. So the fact I'm reading out the slide exactly as it's written is not just bad presentation practice, it's also bad for your learning. There are two channels. I've got this in as much because I have a bit of a vendetta against learning styles. They're not useful educationally, but there is something in it, which is we do sort of have, this is another model here of how your memory works. You do have what's called the visuospatial sketchpad, which is often considered to be pictures and writing, and your auditory loop, which is spoken. It's more pictures and words, So when I was reading that just then, I was using your auditory loop almost twice because I was reading and you were reading. I was reading out, you were reading text. So I was overloading one loop. If we can use both, that can help. We can only take linguistic, auditory stuff in sequentially, really. Looking at a picture, we get lots of information all at once. This applies a lot in teaching if we can use diagrams and mind maps and things. In terms of calling and teaching folk dance, I think this explains why, one of the reasons why a demo is so much better. This is a picture paints 1,000 words in a model. If you can get that demo right and you can make sure everyone can see it in a useful way. But it does mean that you probably would be helpful to talk it through at the same time. Don't just set it off and let it go. Talk it through, because then you're maximizing your impact, because you've got your participants watching it and you're talking it through. But you've got to get a certain amount of quiet to do that sometimes. Otherwise, other people are talking it through, and that's going to overload people because they're not knowing who to focus on. So there's a certain amount of teacher-wise behavior management you might need to do in order to get the most out of a demo. And one of the last things, and this has been a very, very quick canter through a whole load of things, is I think we absolutely need to think about working out our bulletproof definitions. This applies for workshops, titles, and definitions, but also in terms of figures and in terms of dances to some extent. And it's this bit at the bottom. I need to go that way. Being able to articulate the definition before you try and teach something is really an important thing to think about. If you start to teach something, you go, I can't do this because I don't know what it is, that's basically going to stop you teaching it. That's my fundamental thing there. If you can't define it pretty succinctly, and that will vary depending on what you're defining, but if you can't, then you've got a problem in your own thinking for what it is that you are teaching, and that's going to make everything fluffy and not help, because all of this is about you should try and be as precise as possible, essentially. Skip over that one, because this is a big one, and this is a problem for us. Transient information is probably the biggest issue that we have, which is as soon as we've said something, it's gone. That's a problem in all sorts of places. But for a caller stood on stage, we have no way on our stage of making our schema that we think about visible, except through our dancers. So I think it's a real problem if you're stood on stage and your dancers aren't moving as you call for everyone, because they can't see what's going on. This is also why I think a thumbnail sketch of the whole dance after you've done a walkthrough is an unhelpful idea. It overloads the working memory, and it's just transient information that disappears. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's more of a social dance thing than a ceilidh thing for people to do that. First figure of the dance, absolutely, gets people ready. Talking through the whole dance without people moving, transient, disappears. This is what we are trying to do. We are trying to get our schema, the stuff we know, out and visible so people can engage with it. Otherwise, it just disappears. No, I'm not advocating handouts. I don't think we should start down the route of the Sporran book, like in Scottish, which is a great idea for a specific context, but gets into redundancy and all things like that. So, final takeaways from this elevator pitch of cognitive load theory is something we should be thinking about. We should keep everything as simple as we can. That doesn't mean we don't do hard things, It means we think about how we get to hard things. It means we keep how we teach those hard things as focused as possible. Segment and sequence carefully. I'm always thinking this: go slower to go faster. Do the basics well, and then you can get to where you need to go faster. Extraneous load is context dependent. What can you reduce? What can you get shut up? Is the band noodling helpful because they're giving you a good rhythm? Are they just being annoying behind you and distracting people? Depends on the band. Do they need to be doing that? Could be. We should label our workshops clearly, because different levels of expertise need different teaching, and it's not really fair to drop people from different expertise levels into those different workshops, because those different needs won't be met very well. And in general, I was told quite early on by people that teaching was not what people wanted from a caller. I understand what was meant. I did not so much at the time, but I don't think it's true, and I don't think it's really what they meant. They don't want a school teacher stood on stage making them do drills. But more and more, as callers, we have a responsibility to be teaching our dancers all the time. There are no classes. We are the classes. We are the teachers. We are teaching. And not acknowledging that is a problem. So in general, I think we should be doing more teacher training of callers. And there is a whole bunch of knowledge that I've got a list in the back of my head of stuff I really need to make sure someone teaches me, because I've got this whole list of gaps in my knowledge that I think is disappearing if we're not careful. And that has always been the case. There are articles in FDis's magazine going back. Well, I know this because it goes back all the way through the career of John Kirkpatrick, whose website I was on the other day, decrying the decline in the standard of folk dancing. It changes over time, but I think we maybe need to be careful about not losing too many bits and pieces. So yes, thank you very much.